So this is a talk about the Ruby language, an overview of the language itself and of Rails. And my name is Adam Sierpinski, if anybody's watching this who doesn't know me. Okay, so first of all, a little bit about the general syntax of Ruby. So the falsy values in Ruby are only nil and false. So if you want to check in a conditional for something, the only thing that will cause an if clause to fail are those values specifically. So an empty string is truthy, the number 0 is truthy, like pretty much anything else is truthy. Here's basics about a method. So methods, and we call everything methods, by the way. The word function isn't really used, but they're contained with beginning with the def keyword and ending with the word end. So here's a simple method called superfoo, and it takes an argument times to foo. And on line 2 here, you can see the way that variables are declared, which is simply the name of a variable equals sign and then anything after that. So there's no keyword for declaring variables or anything of the sort. And then the times method is called upon times to foo. So the thing you pass in, whatever it happens to be, times is a method that just does a thing that number of times. So there's another block within this method, and do and end take the place of curly braces. And puts is the syntax for printing something to standard out or displaying something on standard out. So puts foo will just, it will display the word bar because of line 2 some number of times that you pass in. So that's the basics of how you create a method. And then I gave myself a reminder to talk about other things. So scope in Ruby, there are different levels of scope. There's global scope, which is indicated with a $sign, and it's never used. I've never ever seen a global variable in Ruby, but you can theoretically do that. General scope is just a variable with no prefix, and it's available outside of classes and outside of methods, but not inside of methods. And then the @sign indicates an instance variable. So when you have a class and you instantiate a class object, the @sign gives scope to everything in that class, everything in that instance of the class rather. And the double @sign is a class variable. So that's that. Self is a keyword similar to this in PHP. So self is a dynamic variable that is the object that something was called upon, or the object that you currently are. And there's a main object that is implicitly used if nothing else is being used. So the global namespace is the main object. And return values. Methods return the last evaluated expression. So there is a return keyword, but idiomatically it's usually not used unless you need to return early in a conditional. Generally you just put the thing you want to return last in the method, and that's what gets returned. In this method, puts foo is the last expression that gets evaluated, and puts returns nil, so this method would return nil. Okay, here's string interpolation. So it only works inside double quotes, but there's the syntax. Pound curly braces, so anything in there gets evaluated as Ruby code and then interpolated into the string. And also I snuck in here default method arguments. So if no argument is passed into this method, it will assume that silly or super is the amount of silliness. Arrays. So unlike PHP, arrays and hashes are two different data structures in Ruby. So arrays are only ordered lists. And so these could be referenced by square bracket with a cell value inside. But that's the only way you can really reference the elements of this array. And then hashes are a different data structure. and they can only be referenced by their keys or values. So you can get the key or the value with one or the other, but they're not numbered in any way. And there are two syntaxes for writing hashes. The one at the top is the older syntax that's always been in Ruby, where you've got a symbol containing the name of the key, and then hash rocket pointing at the value. And then the newer syntax, which is just a symbol, colon, and then the thing. And then I made the first hash, foo hash, the value of another foo hash, just to indicate that you can pretty much store anything. You can store a string, a hash, an array, anything you can store in there. So enumerables are the default way to iterate in Ruby. There are for loops and things like that, but generally speaking, you're going to see each or other members of the enumerable class. So if we've got an array, we can call each on it. So fooArray.each do, and then here's the syntax for a block, where inside those pipes is the way you're going to reference each member of the collection. So same as something in PHP when you're doing a for each. And then we've got puts foo 0 to -5. That'll put out the string characters beginning with the first index of a string until 5 from the end. So with this array, it would print out grumpy, silly, super. And it would leave off the last 5 because of that -5 in the range. Actually, back to here though, map, inject, sort, there are like 30 or 40 of these enumerable methods. So learning that is probably one of the most important things to do if you want to learn Ruby, is just learning all the ways that you can iterate. You can do the same thing with hashes. Inside the pipes, you pass how you want to reference the keys and how you want to reference the values. So other than that, it's the same. And then most blocks are indicated with do and end, but just as a style guide type of a thing, if your block of code fits all on one line, generally you see it contained in curly braces instead of do and end. And then the other thing I wanted to mention here is that the map method has a cousin mapBang that does something more exciting. And that's another common thing in Ruby. There's really no connection other than it's a convention to make two similar methods that do something more permanent by the other one that's named with a bang at the end. So map does what map does in most languages. It modifies the array and returns a new array. But mapBang actually modifies the array that it's called upon. It doesn't just return a new value, but it changes in place the existing array. And then metaprogramming is a big part of Ruby culture, I guess. So here are some of the common methods that are used to do metaprogramming. The send method, which calls the method that you pass through in its arguments. Method missing is an interesting one that defines what happens when you try to call a method that doesn't exist. So you can write code inside the method missing, which is a special reserved method, that tells the program what to do if you call a method that doesn't exist. And theoretically, you could write your whole code base in there if you wanted to be crazy. And define method is a way to define a method with a dynamic name. So here what we have is this method metafoo that takes an array and an argument, and then on each element of the array that you pass in, it calls a method whose name is the value in each cell of the array. So if you pass a foo array, presumably that array would contain a number of method names, and then you'd call them all with the same argument. So here's object orientation in Ruby. Class is just declared with the word class. It starts with a capital letter. And then right below that, this attribute reader and attribute accessor, these are how you set your getter and setter methods. You could write out, like, let's see, what do we have here for let's drop down. I'll come back to that. Initialize is what it looks for when it instantiates an instrument. So when you do instrument.new, it'll look for an initialize method, and here's how it starts out the object. So instruments in this case have a primary material, and if you wanted a getter method like primary material equals or return me the primary material, those two lines at the top of the class are how you do it. So a reader gives you access to the getter method, and accessor gives you access to the setter and getter method. So you can set a genre, or you can just read what the material is on this class. Adder writer exists, but I've never seen it because I don't know the use case for wanting to be able to write and modify, but not be able to read. So you don't see that very often. Self.all, self here is the class. So this is a class method that returns all of the instruments. So when in the initialize method, oh, I didn't say what the shovel is. So at instruments is the class variable, which is an array. And this is how you push to an array with those two little arrows. So self in the initialize method is the instance of the object. And if you push it to the array at the class level, then that's a way to recall all of the objects that exist that have been instantiated within that class. That is really wordy. Ruby has a lot of gems, which are just another word for libraries. And pry is, I'll just talk about a couple of the gems. Pry is one that's used for debugging. So if you require pry, and then further down in your code, stick the line binding.pry, when that line is reached, it'll open in your terminal to the line of code you're on, and you can see what the variables are at that point in time. So in this case, it wouldn't be particularly surprising to see what name is. I guess it's not a really good use case for using a binding. But this is just a way to debug code. RSpec is a popular gem for testing. And here's just a little example of what the RSpec syntax is like, where you describe a thing, like an object probably, or a class, and then describe how it ought to behave. So this is sort of a DSL that reads a little bit like English, where you expect lake.name to equal the name of the lake, and it will tell you if your tests aren't passing. Rack is, I'm actually not sure if it's a gem, but what it is a thin little interface, almost more like a spec for how frameworks and servers ought to talk to one another. And so basically any server or framework that is popular is Rack compliant. And so this is just the interface of how they talk to each other, so you can easily swap out any popular server and any popular framework and make them work together. And a little overview of the rest of the Ruby ecosystem. Sinatra is a really popular lightweight framework that's probably pretty similar to CodeIgniter. It's not big and bulky like Rails. Rails, of course, is the most popular Ruby framework. Almost all professional Ruby development is done on Rails. Volt is an interesting full-stack Ruby framework that has a transpiler that transpiles Ruby down to JavaScript for the front end. And Ruby Motion is for iOS apps. And those are, I mean, Rails is really by far the most popular framework. I'll talk about that next. And then there are a few runtimes. MRI is Matt's, who created Ruby's runtime, and Matt's Ruby interpreter. So that's the runtime that by default runs, and most Ruby implementations are using MRI. JRuby runs on the Java virtual machine, so people who need more performance than what the C-Ruby, a C-based Ruby can give you, are using JRuby. It changes a few things. I think Ruby's mostly written in C, and some of the built-in Ruby methods don't work as well on JRuby, but most of them work better, or faster anyway. So that's sort of like a more advanced use case to use JRuby, but it's out there. And Rubinius I don't know much about, other than it's another runtime that you can use. So Rails, it is magic, and magic can mean good or bad depending on your viewpoint. But the gist of Rails is that if you follow the Rails conventions, you can spin up apps really, really quickly with not a lot of code. You do have to pretty much do things the Rails way, or it's not a good use case for using Rails in the first place. But here's how you do it. If you've got Rails installed on your computer, which you would install by doing gem install Rails on your terminal, Rails new, and then the name of your app spins up the app. It'll create a whole structure of folders in the layout of the app. And then you can generate a resource, Rails G resource. And a resource is a model, a database migration, and a controller. So if you type awesome resource, you're going to get all those things for your resource. So I see the example of making a blog a lot of times. So if post is a thing in your blog, if the blog has posts, you would get all those things by typing Rails G resource post. And then I'll come back to RakeDB migrate and RakeDB seed in a second. And that second has come. So generally, if you're creating a new Rails app, one of the first things you would need to do is create some tables in your database. And having a class that inherits from active record migration is the way you do it. This is the way you create a table. So you've got inside your change method, create table. This is a table for songs. And then you can see that songs have a name, which is a string, and a composer ID, which is an integer, and so forth. And the way that it really works is you create these migration files from the terminal so that they get timestamped. And then when you actually want to migrate and set up your database, it runs them sequentially. And the best practice is when you need to change things about your table, you do it with another change file that's timestamped after the creation ones. So if you decide that composer ID for whatever reason shouldn't be an integer, it should be a string, you would just change it with a subsequent migration file. And that's a way for different developers to be able to always have their databases in the same state. And then concurrently, you would generally have a DB seed file where you seed the database with some example data. And that way you can wipe your database clean and just run the seed task and seed the database this way. So these examples create some users, create some topics, and then on line 3 and 4, they shovel a certain topic into the user's list of topics, relating them together. And backing up one more time, Rake is, I guess it's like grunt tasks or something like that, but it's just tasks that do a one-off script. They like kind of fire off a script. So RakeDB migrate sets up your database, and then RakeDB seed seeds it with data. The next thing you would do is go to the config folder and the routes file and set up routes. Probably one of the least magical things about Rails is that you have to create your routes. Routes don't exist unless you list them here. So users will get 404 error unless your routes are here. So root home index means if somebody just goes to your domain with no suffix after that, it'll look for the home controller and an index method on the home controller. And then resources, songs. Resources would generally create 7 routes for songs. So that would be songs/new, songs/create, songs/index, and show. And the best practice here is to always restrict to the ones you're actually going to use. It's generally seen to be bloated and confusing to have a bunch of routes available that aren't actually used. So a good idea to just restrict them to the ones you'll use. Next, we've got models. So model event inherits from active record base. I think active record is the coolest part about Rails. It makes interacting with the database really, really easy. So validates address means that an event will not be saved unless it contains an address. It's sort of at the code level, as you could also do that it can't be null on the database level, but this just means it won't try to fire the SQL unless it's got an address. Belongs to project creates that join table association. So the fact that you've got this belongs to project method there means that you can call event.project and that will do something. And then similarly, it's got users through events users means you can do event.users and return an array of users. So all those SQL commands are set up just through these simple methods.
I saw has many. Is there a has one?
Belongs to is kind of the equivalent of that. So, well,
this is all two other tables. This is
not
my own data in my own table.
Yeah, so these are table to table relations. Yeah, there's belongs to has many. There's has and belongs to many. There may be others, but those are the ones I've used, I guess. And also, it's not at all uncommon to have a model that looks only like this, that has these relationships defined and no other code. That's pretty common. Here are some more methods that go just a small step further. So let's look at the bottom one, def truncated name. So name is a field on the table, a column on the table. And I'll pause here to say that one thing I do not like about Rails is it's not clear when you look at a model what tables the database has. The methods all exist. Like if the table has columns, you've got methods named after all those columns, but you don't see them anywhere. So unless you look in the database migration files, you won't know the schema. So if you don't have your schema handy, it can be a little confusing. But in this case, name exists as a method because it's a column in the table. And it's using the explicit self. So in this method, it's really, you could read it like self.name. You just don't tend to write self a lot in Ruby. You could, it wouldn't change the value. And then truncate is a method that shortens it to the number of characters passed in. So this is a really common thing where you'll just extend the return value of a database query by doing some kind of manipulation. And similarly, start date is a database column. So the SQL query returns the start date, and then this formats it in a certain way for passing to the view. And actually, I should just point for a second at suggested users here. So this is more of a sophisticated query that couldn't be done just with the built-in .name or .start time.
Are those method names magic?
Like joins, for instance?
Like formatted start. Is formatted a special word there?
No. So formatted start is just the name I gave it.
Okay.
Yeah. And start date is only magic in that it's a method that was not defined anywhere, and it exists because there's a column name on the table by that name. Yeah. So controllers, generally in Rails apps, you'll see almost all of the logic in the models. And so these really thin controller methods are pretty typical. And the way it works is in the routes file, if you define that there is projects/index, then it'll come here and find the projects/index method. And then it will continue to your view folder and find a view called in the projects/index. So all of that routing, once the route exists, the rest of it is pretty magic, where all you have to define in your controller is what data am I going to pass to the view. So in this case, @projects is the data you're going to pass to the view, and it's just simply project.all. So for an index page, you're sending a list of all the projects and all of the data that the database contains, basically. For the show page, which is generally where you're going to see a single project, it'll find it by params. And params ID really means / the ID. So if you type in the URL project/1, then you're going to see that the project that would get passed to the view layer is the project whose ID is 1. Generally, you'll see I kind of left something out here, but the way that you write private methods is simply to write the word private, and then the ones below that are private. And if you're going to have something that saves to the database, you first have to have this params.require where you specifically list out the values you're going to accept on post parameters. So it won't let you save to the database if you didn't explicitly lay out what you're willing to accept. That's just a security thing to prevent mass assignment issues. GitHub was taken down. I don't know if you guys heard about that, but somebody who had a problem with this security flaw in Rails, because GitHub is a Rails app, somebody took down GitHub just to show what a big problem mass assignment is, and it was quickly patched thereafter. So that's why the parameters are required. ERB, embedded Ruby, is the default view syntax, and it's a lot like PHP to my eyes. So everything inside these little things is evaluated as Ruby code, and everything inside these things with an equal sign is evaluated and echoed to the screen. So event.formatted start would be, that's presumably like a time, and that would be echoed to the screen. So that's pretty straightforward. A lot of people also like using HAML instead of ERB, and of course a lot of people like using Angular or React or whatever else for their view layer. Form helper is a nice little thing. You pass it a bit of data, and then it creates a form. And if this form is being used for, like, the fact that project exists as something that I can pass through means it has values, and its values will all be populated onto the form. So if I wanted to edit a project, the project's current name and neighborhood would be auto-populated by virtue of having passed the object in. And then I'll talk about just a few other cool things about Rails. One is the asset pipeline, which is the way that CSS and JavaScript files are handled, and for that matter, CoffeeScript and Sass files as well. So all of the JavaScript and CSS and CoffeeScript and Sass files that you have in your project are all compiled down to one CSS and one JavaScript file, and they're just served together in bulk. So it's just something to be aware of, that you have to be careful with your variable naming in JavaScript especially, because you can easily pollute a large project by having a lot of global variables, because they are served to every single page, not just the one page you intended your JavaScript to run on. That's potentially a downside, but the bright side is that the page loads are really efficient after the first page. So as you're scrolling through or surfing through a Rails app, you aren't re-downloading assets on each page. So I'll skip to TurboLinks after that. TurboLinks is a default in new versions of Rails. It's pretty controversial, and what it does is it makes every page refresh done by Ajax. So as you surf around a Rails site, every single page, it sort of behaves like a single page app. So every page is just refreshed, just the body is refreshed, not the header. I like it. I think it's pretty cool. It does require you to write jQuery in a different way, because document.ready never happens when every page is just loaded on Ajax, but there's a well-known workaround. Development mode, I guess I mostly mean by that when you get any kind of an error when you're in development mode in Ruby, it puts the console on the screen so you can debug right on your web browser. And that's just something that is there for development mode. It turns off when you ship to production. And Action Mailer is just a nice mail helper to send emails. And that's all I got. Questions? Nope?
No, it's really cool.
Can you go back to the first page?
Yeah.
Okay, not that first page. Okay, yeah. Okay, so if 0 is true
Yeah.
or false.
It's true. If 0 is true. So basically, conditionals can be used to say, does this thing exist at all, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's 0, that's true. Proceed.
And so if you ask, you would never, I guess you probably wouldn't, 'cause I guess I could imagine that being a strange combination with the fact that methods return whatever the last line was.
I don't know. I guess
I guess because empty string returns true, and a lot of it might be, or wait, or is it nil? Like if if the last thing that it does is printing something.
if the last thing it does is printing something, it returns nil.
Yeah.
So-
Okay.
The printer returns, puts.
Puts returns nil. Yeah, I mean, so return values you have to get used to. Like each returns the original array that it was called on, and you just start to
figure out
think
what it
about
is.
what it's returning. Yeah. So it's probably more common to see an explicit return nil in a Ruby method if that's what you need it to do. You would make sure that it doesn't return 0 if you're later going to use it to check a conditional.
Do you have a double and a triple equals?
Yeah.
Are nil and false double equal true, but triple equal false?
Yes. That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And I didn't go over it, but so if conditionals use double equals so that it's easier to meet the criteria, I suppose, and case statements use triple. So depending on what you're going for, one of those things might be better for you than the other.
Okay. The built-in is double and the built-in is triple.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's one you want to know going in.
Yeah. Yeah.
At some point you said, this happens, it opens a terminal, or it does this in your terminal.
Oh, I was talking about pry. Here. So
How does it know where my terminal is?
I don't know. I mean, I guess you execute a Ruby file from the terminal. You say Ruby and then Ruby this file.
Okay.
So you started there. I don't know, but it'll pause your code, and then in your terminal you can interact with Ruby and type any Ruby code you want, including.
So is it useful if that's served from Apache?
What do you mean?
If I've got my website,
Yeah.
then I'm not running Ruby, right? Or not true?
I've got websites running Ruby, so maybe I don't know what you're.
No, but if I have a site running, I envision you're running a web server that calls Ruby whenever it gets the URL for your Ruby code.
Yep.
That Ruby isn't attached to a terminal.
Oh, so this is just for developing on your local machine, as far as I'm
Okay.
aware.
Okay.
Yeah, it totally freezes the program, so you wouldn't want it to happen in a.
On a web server, that'd be bad.
Yeah, so we joke like when a known Ruby website is down, like we joke that the developer probably forgot to remove a binding.pry, because it really would freeze up. The page wouldn't load. Nothing. It would just be forever paused.
Right.
So do remember to delete these pries, because it does stop the code when you get there. But I love it for debugging. Another thing I didn't mention about the terminal. Let me go to my terminal here. If you type IRB, once you've got Ruby installed on your computer, you're in a Ruby REPL, and you can. Oh, come on. Oh, that's not a string. So foo equals the string bar. You can just play around with Ruby within IRB. And that's the same view you'd get when a binding.pry stops you.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Awesome. how did you make these sweet slides? I'm sorry, I'm asking terrible questions.
Yeah, so Reveal.js is the bulk of the technology, and then my friend wrote a little Ruby wrapper around Reveal.js, but this is the syntax for writing the slides.
Oh, cool.
So it's just give it a title, and then this is just the way to write it in Ruby, but you can also write it in JavaScript the way that Reveal.js was really intended to be used. And then all the code blocks point at individual code files.
Oh, cool.
So you have to have a folder for the project or for the slide presentation. All right, thanks for listening.